6b, examine two factors. So 8-mark question, if it's two factors, we're going to have to do two separate paragraphs, which influence the supply of labour in the electronics industry. So via content mastery, you should already be able to recall factors that influence the elasticity or just influence the supply of labour. We have extensive flashcards of that on, that is udoecon.com, cheeky plug. But besides that, what are the factors? So we have things like wage rates. So wage rates, of course, determine the elasticity or the supply of labour, since if wages are too low, there's no incentive for workers to supply their labour. And then things like skills and qualifications, they very much affect the degree, the elasticity of the supply of labour. Unemployment levels, since if very high unemployment levels, very low unemployment levels, they affect the supply of labour. Also, the things like time frame, short run versus long run, that's also a massive factor that affects the supply of labour. But this question has not it's not directed us to any extracts. But of course, you need to remember, in this 8-mark question, there are 2 application marks. So there will be some information about this in the extracts. You just have to kind of look around a bit more for it. So the first thing I'll do, supply of labour, electronics industry. I'm going to just scan through the titles, see if there's any title that matches with that. So merger, no. Problem waste, no. Labour shortages, perfect. So extract B, labour shortages. So this, of course, aligns quite well with the supply of labour question. Let's analyse this extract and find any reasons that affect the supply of labour. So every year, highly skilled and experienced employees in the electronics industry retire. First reason right there. Of course, if highly skilled individuals are retiring, they're losing the workforce, they're becoming economically inactive. Therefore, of course, that could be one reason there. The current tight labour market. Now, what does tight labour market mean? Tight labour market means there's lots of available job vacancies, but essentially no one to take on those vacancies. Then if we keep reading, especially since the nature of the industry is becoming increasingly technical, so what is that referring to? Skills, isn't it? So it's becoming increasingly skillful, and the more skillful a role is, the less individuals there are that can fill that role. Why? Since a high level of skill, the more time, the more effort it requires to build those skills. Again, it's referring more and more to high levels of skills. And then here, however, artificial intelligence and other new technologies can help fill some of the skill gaps. It literally uses the word however, so that's a great evaluation for your 8-mark question. Okay, so the question is, of course, asking for 2 points. I've labelled 1 point up. Then my second point is just going to be about the skills. So the nature of skills become more technical. So this first point I'm going to refer more to when individuals retire, it reduces the supply of labour, and it means that they can't train up the younger workers, since of course one way that older workers really benefit and highly skillful workers benefit firms is that they're able to train up the newly employed, the workers with lower skills, so uptrain them to get to their level. So they lose out on that also, but then also the nature of the industry is becoming more technical, which is a great second point. Now for these 8-mark questions, I try to emphasise as much as possible to students. They are probably the trickiest question on the entire paper, not due to the question itself, due to the time trap. Students end up wasting way too much time on these questions than it's necessary, especially when it's 2 factors. It is an extremely simple question. I'm going to try to demonstrate this in my answer, writing it as simply as possible, as efficient as possible. You do not want to waste any more than 8 minutes. So for my first factor that influences supply of labour, this is going to be the elasticity of that labour, since in the extract it refers to the work becoming more technical, it becoming more complex. Therefore, what does that mean? It means that a high skill set is required to complete this role. And now, if we think to a labour supply and demand diagram, so wages on the y-axis, quantity of labour on the x-axis, if we think about a supply curve, sorry, I can't draw a supply curve. So if you think about an inelastic supply curve, what does it represent? It represents, despite a steep increase in wage, there's a very small increase in the quantity of labour supply. So a disproportionately large increase in wage, but only a small increase in the quantity of labour supplied. And why is that? Since these workers have high skills, and to develop these high level of skills, it requires several years of training. Thus, an increase in wage will suddenly lead to a massive increase in the quantity of labour. Therefore, one factor that influences the supply of labour is essentially the high skill set required for this role. So this is how I would write my first paragraph. So point, application, a bit of explanation. Then of course you need to end it off with an evaluation point. And the main thing I want to demonstrate by writing it here is just, this is more than what you need for an 8-mark question, but do not overwrite. Students add way too much chain of analysis detail. Please keep in mind, there are 2 marks for knowledge, 2 application, 2 analysis, and 2 evaluation. Like an evaluation over 2 or 3 lines It's just not necessarily at all, and just wasting your time. And you can 100% get away. If you've got one developed evaluation point, you can 100% get away with one evaluation point. You do not need to evaluate both paragraphs. But if you have the time, we do advise you to do 2 evaluation points just to make sure you're safe. But yeah, with regards to evaluation, just very simple evaluation from the extract. It talks about how AI can fill the skill gap, and I always encourage students, if there's evaluation in the extract, if there are evaluatory points in the extract, you need to use them, since that is what the examiners are looking for. Anyway, so let's move on to the second paragraph point. So the first one we mentioned about skills. The second one was more to do with the size of the workforce becoming smaller, which is essentially that the high skilled workers were retiring. So let's see how to put this into words. So for the second paragraph, like I said, the skilled workers are retiring, they cannot pass on their skill set, and also the firms are just losing some of their most experienced employees. Of course, these employees are already trained, they've already invested into these employees. Now they are retiring, they basically lose out. They have to replace them now with the new employees, new graduates who do not have the skill set, who need time, who need training to gain that skill set. Then of course a tight labour market, so even though there are lots of opportunities out there, it looks like there's not enough graduates to fill those opportunities. So really like a bad dilemma here. But really simply, this is how I'd word it. So one of the factors is a shortage of staff is shown by the tight labour market, which indicates ample vacancies but lack of workers to fill them vacancies, and skilled workers retired, which of course reduces the supply of labour, causes an inward shift, reducing the number of workers. Then that is pretty much all right for analysis. Like I said, there's 2 analysis marks, this 8-mark question, so you do not need much to pick up those marks. But with regards to evaluation, I've talked about the tight labour market, maybe due to the low wages affected by offered by firms, thus lowering the incentive for new graduates to join. So essentially, we say there's lots of vacancies in these firms. The best way to incentivize workers is increasing wages, and the way you can solve this tight labour market is by increasing wages, thus incentivizing workers to join the jobs and take up these roles. But yeah, that is the 8-mark question done. This is, I wouldn't say it's a tricky 8-mark question. It's just a lot of these 8-mark questions are so simple that they're hard. And I do understand when students say that, when they're not very based in theory, there's not much economics theory to say about them, but just stick to the structure, just stick to what they're asking you, just be very transactional with these questions. Yes, they're not really asking you to go into depth with the economics theory, but you just have to accept it. Just go with it, fill in the structure basically, fill in the blanks, and just get done with the questions so you can focus on those questions that actually are skillful, that allow you to show your economics theory, so like the 15, the 25-mark questions. But that is the 8-mark question done.